Before fire, before tools, before language, there was only survival, roughly 8.8 million years ago. Earth was a world ruled by tooth and claw. The land was wild, the weather unpredictable, and life was a constant struggle. In the heart of Africa, among the shadows of thick forests and vast grasslands, lived creatures on the edge of two worlds, not quite apes, not yet human. They were our earliest ancestors. They didn't rule the landscape. They were small, vulnerable, and often prey. Every step outside the trees brought danger. Predators were everywhere. A single mistake could mean death. But these beings had something different. Something that couldn't be seen but would change. Everything. They were learning, watching, remembering. At first, they lived high in the trees. Their hands were perfect for climbing. Their bodies were built for balance, for leaping between branches and escaping threats from the ground. The trees gave them fruit, shelter, and a chance to raise their young in relative safety. But the world was changing. Rainforests began to thin. Open grasslands began to spread. The climate was growing harsher. With fewer trees, these early hominins were forced to adapt. They began to spend more time on the ground, walking upright, hesitantly at first, but over time more confidently. Walking on two legs wasn't easy. It was slower, more exhausting. But it gave a vital advantage: height. It allowed them to see over tall grass, to spot predators before it was too late, and to carry food and infants while traveling. It was a small change, but a critical one. They didn't speak as we do, but they communicated. With glances, with grunts, with movement. Slowly, the roots of social understanding were taking hold. Gestures became meaningful. Reactions became shared. Bonds grew deeper. These creatures formed small, tight-knit groups. Families, perhaps. They shared food, groomed each other, watched over the weak. When one was injured, others stayed close. This was more than instinct. This was the beginning of empathy. Their minds were changing too. They remembered where the ripest fruit grew. They learned to identify dangerous animals by their calls. They started to understand patterns in nature, when the rains would come, where the rivers flowed, which paths were safest. It was primitive intelligence, but intelligence nonetheless. And then came the bones. They began to scavenge the remains left behind by large predators. They didn't kill, not yet, but they learned to follow, to wait, to act quickly when the moment was right. A lion's leftovers could mean a full meal for the bold and clever. Some individuals discovered they could use stones, not shaped tools, but natural rocks heavy enough to break open bones and reach the marrow inside. Marrow was rich in fat and nutrients, fueling the development of larger brains over generations. No one taught them, no one led them. But slowly the knowledge spread. The young copied the old. Behavior seen once could be remembered for a lifetime. Learning was no longer accidental, it was social. Each generation became slightly more capable. Their world was full of threats: leopards, snakes, crocodiles, wild dogs. But instead of hiding forever, they adapted to live among them. They became faster, more alert, better at predicting danger before it struck. They didn't dominate. They endured. At night, they huddled together in trees or caves, protecting each other from the dark. Their senses were sharp, their reactions fast. Wasn't just survival, it was cooperation. Trust was beginning to take shape. They began to follow patterns of animal behavior. When vultures circled in the distance, they knew a kill had happened. When herds moved, they followed, not as predators, but as opportunists. Slowly, the idea of controlling their environment was forming. They began to understand cause and effect. If a tree bore fruit once, it might again. If they cracked a nut with a rock, they could eat what was inside. If they stayed silent while observing an animal, they could learn its movements. These were not simple acts. These were early strategies. From strategy, something powerful emerged: foresight. They were no longer reacting blindly. They were starting to anticipate. That made them different from the animals around them. While other species lived in the moment, these early hominins began to live slightly ahead of it. This change in thinking slow and invisible, was the beginning of what would make us human. They still lacked fire. They still lacked language. We're still fragile, still hunted, still limited by the tools nature had given them, but their minds were expanding. Every memory stored, every behavior copied, every danger avoided, it all added up across thousands of years. Those small changes became survival advantages, and generation after generation. These advantages shaped evolution itself. They didn't know what they were becoming. They had no concept of the future, but they were laying the foundation for something extraordinary. They were learning to learn, and that would change the world. Because the moment our ancestors began to think beyond instinct, to remember, to teach, to plan, they started the long journey from the wild to civilization. That journey would take millions of years, but it began right here in the shadows of the savannah, among the quiet footsteps of beings who dared to stand up and look forward. Fire. It didn't come from invention. It came from observation. A flash in the sky, a tree struck down, flames dancing wildly. In the dark, at first, our ancestors feared it. Fire was unpredictable, dangerous. But then, something changed. They began to see what fire could do. It could chase away predators. It could warm cold bodies. It could turn raw flesh into something easier to chew and digest. At some point, no one knows exactly when, they began to preserve it, carrying embers from place to place, protecting it like a treasure, letting it burn through the night, fed by dry leaves and twigs. They didn't create fire, not yet, but they learned to keep it alive. And with fire, the nights changed, no longer ruled by fear. Early humans gathered around its light. The smoke kept insects away. The warmth held back the cold. For the first time, there was a space where thinking could happen without constant terror. This was more than comfort. This was freedom. Fire transformed the way they lived. Cooked food unlocked new energy. It softened roots, nuts, and meat. It made digestion easier. More nutrients meant stronger bodies, sharper minds, and faster development in the young. Cooking was not just a survival strategy, it was an evolutionary catalyst. It was around this fire that another revolution began. Community. Not every creature could start a fire, but anyone could benefit from it. And so, sharing began. Not out of generosity, but necessity. Group survival meant individual survival. They began to cooperate more in hunting, in caring for the sick, raising the young. These were the roots of society. They still couldn't speak with words. But something new was forming, a deeper understanding between individuals. Emotions showed in the eyes. Warnings were given with subtle movements. The rhythm of life began to follow patterns of connection. Then came the tools. At first, stones were simply picked up and used. But over time, hands grew smarter. A rock wasn't just a rock, it was a weapon, a blade, a hammer. Homo habilis, the handyman, began to strike stones together, flaking off sharp edges to create the first tools with intention. These tools weren't beautiful, they were crude, but they worked. They split bone, sliced meat, scraped hides. Meant survival didn't rely on claws or teeth, it relied on planning, on precision, on creativity. Tool use wasn't just about survival, it changed the way their brains worked. It forced them to think ahead, to picture outcomes, to choose materials, to pass on techniques. Knowledge became something shared, not just remembered. And so, the mind evolved. From this came something even more powerful. Hunting no longer limited to scavenging. Early humans began to pursue prey, not by strength, not by speed, but through patience and cooperation. They watched animals, understood behavior, moved silently, waited for the right moment. A chase wasn't just about instinct anymore. It was a plan. They created simple weapons, sharpened sticks, heavy stones, primitive clubs. In groups, they set traps, drove animals toward cliffs, surrounded smaller prey with noise and intimidation. Their tactics weren't perfect, but they were new, and they worked. Meat gave more energy. Fat fueled brain growth. Hunting bonded the group in new ways. Each member had a role, each hunt a lesson passed down. It wasn't just about killing. It was about learning, evolving, remembering as. The body adapted, so did the mind. The human brain was changing, growing larger, more complex. With it came awareness, memory, curiosity, the ability to imagine what didn't exist yet. And this imagination led to the birth of something unexpected. Culture, not in art, not in words, but in patterns, behaviors repeated, lessons taught. Rituals performed, they began to bury their dead. Perhaps they grieved, perhaps they hoped, perhaps they simply remembered. They sat in circles, shared food, shared fire, shared stories not with language, but with movement, sound, and emotion. This was the spark that separated us from the rest of the animal world. They began to migrate. Small bands moved across the land, chasing herds, escaping drought, seeking safety. Rivers became highways. Mountains became barriers to overcome. The world became a place to explore, not just endure. They reached new regions, new climates, new challenges, and still they adapted. Each generation slightly different. From the last, faces changing, skulls expanding, hands becoming more dexterous, minds more focused. They were still not yet us, but they were close. These were the ancestors who would one day give rise to Homo erectus, the upright man, a being who walked long distances, built more complex tools, may have mastered fire, and began to shape the world with intention. But that's a story for another time. For now, we remember the ones who came before even them, the early walkers, the first tool makers, the quiet hunters in the wild. They left no written words, no monuments, no names. But in every fire we lighting, every tool we create, and every story we tell, they live on because we are not separate from them. We are them continued, and their journey is ours.